Okay.
Action.
Action. That's perfect. That's right. So here we are in 2020, Mommy, and we are in the middle of a global pandemic, COVID-19, and we have also had a series of racial uprising, I like to call it. And so I think it's important for us to talk. When you and I talked about this, we said we would call it the evolution of a revolutionary. Because you wanted to share some of your thoughts about where we are right now at this point in time. So what are some of your thoughts?
If I could begin, I'd like to talk about who I am today and who I used to be at one point. I grew up in Thomasville, Georgia. I was born in 1946. So I grew up at a period of time when what we have today is heavenly compared with the circumstances that existed. But it's very interesting that despite living in a time when isms were so prevalent, if isms based upon race, isms based upon other things, I have an interesting perspective. When I started school, I went to school for 4 hours a day for the first 6 years of my life. And I thought that was normal. I didn't know that children went to school all day. I was in college before I knew that that was not the norm. Growing up in Georgia, by the time I started college at the age of 16, I met John Lewis, who was 22 at the time. And he was already a civil rights activist. And it was just so wonderful for me finally to be able to do something about the types of isms based upon race that I had experienced growing up. Even though I have to admit, growing up in Thomasville, Georgia was actually overall very, very pleasant because my father came from a position of humanism, and he was so humanistic that no one could dislike who he was, and that created a circle of a protection around us. And I worked with John Lewis, went to jail, have scars to prove it, Philippa Thompson, and John was like, even though he was older, he was really like our little brother. It was like a group of us, 4 females who were working very closely.
Let's listen to Grandmommy closely, okay?
At the time.
Thank you for being such a great girl.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Within a year of working with John, I met Akbar Muhammad Ahmed, and he introduced me to something that was called the Revolutionary Action Movement. This was one of the first movements in this entire country that was a nonviolent as opposed to what John Lewis opposed. In addition to that, it added another ism to the whole issue of race. It added the ism of class and of economic oppression. So this movement was, this entire movement shifted, it broadened the perspective of isms, because the notion of RAM was that you can't talk only about the ism that we call race without talking about the ism that we call class, because these things are sectorally related to each other. And I became very involved with that. And RAM is actually the movement that ended up setting the basis eventually for the emergence of the Black Panthers and some of the other groups that were revolutionary groups.
What does RAM stand for?
Revolutionary Action Movement. And for those who are curious, if you look, there used to be a magazine that was very popular in that period that was called Rampart Magazine. And if you look in the November 1964 issue, which is in archives and somewhere, you will be able to find an article that associates me. My name at that time was Betty Rush, and the whole group of us who had been involved with the civil rights movement had shifted to RAM. Okay, over time, so I want to jump from there to the present. So the question becomes, as an ex-revolutionary, how have I evolved? And what message would I give to those people today, those people who are marching, those people who are sitting at home and not participating in any way? And how does the COVID movement and this resurgence of the isms around, of trying to combat isms around race, how do those things intersect? They intersect in an interesting way. If you think about COVID, you look at something that's a threat to humanity. If you look at the data and you look at the way the whole COVID movement has been managed, you began to see that the fragmentation by nationalism, which is another ism, you see what I really call tribalism operative, but preventing the coming together of people from different nations, different classes, different races, ethnicities, different genders, different sexual preferences. You see all of the isms preventing humankind coming together to come up with solutions to COVID.
Well,
And
I hold on. I have to, of course, I have to interject.
I
And
want you to.
and I just we're at 6 minutes and 33 seconds. I want us to make sure we keep this to 10 minutes, but we can always do more, if we need to. But really quickly though, some would say that over the years, we've been that melting pot. What you're talking about, the human melting pot, we've been that melting pot. Me now here at 45 years old, your youngest daughter, your sixth child, and I, remember hearing about you and Daddy protesting in the 60s. I remember being a teenager and protesting Desert Storm and other things, and as a teenager and in my 20s. So some would say, well, wait a minute, we haven't made any movement since your original protest since the 1960s.
Exactly, but you're making my point, because there has not been, and I don't call it a melting pot. There has never been a platform that says you cannot address isms singularly. You've always had a market segmentation approach to isms.
That's not true, though. Think about it. Everyone now is saying all lives matter. They're saying, and people are saying no, because, for example, going back, my experience is that as a Black woman, especially in higher ed recently, everything is blanketed in diversity, right? Everything. You have to say diverse. You cannot say the Black people. You cannot say the Black movement. You cannot, it has to be blanketed in diversity. That is the humanist movement. But what has happened is that you see this generation, they feel silenced because we don't have any strong Black leaders like the ones that you've mentioned that are there for us to remind us who we are.
But see, that when you use the term diversity does not say, first of all, that we're all cousins. People are anthropologically illiterate. That's one thing. So when you began looking anthropologically, you see that all humans are cousins. We look different and all of those things. You also began to see that if you look at during the earliest phases of humankind, you see all types of incivilities directed against each other, because the different clusters of humans they did behave in an uncivil way. So they were enemies to each other. So if we come to the present now, the question becomes, if we can have a COVID, there are also threats coming from outer space. There are threats coming from the environment. The whole issue becomes, how is humankind, what are the barriers that are keeping all of these cousins who have been separated by isms? That's what has been keeping these cousins from collaborating in such a way that we can ensure that Aya, which is why I wanted her, that Aya's great grandchildren will still be able to survive. So, and these are increasing, but we can see them in other periods. But during those other periods, people did not have the technological capability, their brains had not developed to the degree that they could come up to, as a collective and create ways for humans to survive all of the types of challenges. Now, the thing is that when evolution takes place, the evolution it's not just an evolution of our bodies. It has to be an evolution of what I call the energy that lives within.
The being, that, I've been thinking about recently how we're called human beings for a reason. It's the spirit inside of our flesh.
Exactly.
That's the beings that we are.
Right.
Now we're at 11 minutes now. So I want to ask you, for the young, specifically Black children who are out there, your grandsons, your granddaughters, they make it something actionable. So we're talking theoretically, but if you were to tell them, here are some action steps you can take for your futures, what would you tell them?
See, behavior, baby girl, flows from your entire, what takes place inside. It flows from theory. It flows from the ontology that one adopts. So my message to them is to first broaden your ontology and understand that we're all cousins. The second thing is that there are multiple isms. Over time, what we've done is to try to look at these isms one by one. Over here you have a group who's looking at the ism called race. Over here we have a group who's looking at the ism called heterosexism. Over here we have another group who's looking at the ism based upon sex. Over there we have another different type of isms based upon religion. The thing is that, this is the most important part, is that isms lead to uncivil behavior. The objective of all of our marching, and this is what people are not saying, the objective of the young people who are today focusing upon the ism called race, if we shift it, if we focus upon only the ism called race, there are so many other things that even are integrated. For example, with the ism called race, one of the things that has happened over time is that your generation and some of the younger generations have developed an external locus of control. The external locus of control gives you the impression that these isms can keep you down. An internal locus of control says that yes, we have these isms, but nevertheless, the energy within me, the power of one, can rise. When I say rise, I don't mean in the way in my revolutionary days that we meant rise. I meant can be whole and can help heal. Even if you look at some of the progress that we've made in the past, it was made by a few people who went past those isms and said, let me focus upon what humankind needs. When we look at the HBCUs, which were so critical to this ism called race, Howard University was started by an energy who happened to be in a flesh clothing of a people who's had been born in Europe, was a European American who helped work with people of African descent to start Howard University and to start so many of the HBCUs. If we go all the way back to the Underground Railroad, there were people whose energies were clothed in different patterns, but who understand the importance of overcoming isms, the importance of civilities, of the energies to each other independently of that flesh clothing that one was wearing. One of the things.
Well, I do want to interject real quick. So one of the things that you were talking about the isolated perspective of isms, we call that intersectionality now. So we have evolved in that a lot of people understand that we are all multiple identities, right?
Oh,
we
yes.
have, there are some who are Black, there are some who are queer, there are some who are Latinx, there are some who are, Chicano. We're all constantly border crossing. We're all intersectional. So, to a certain extent, I don't agree necessarily. I mean, I see what you mean, that we have been looking at them isolated. And then there has always been the human rights movement. I mean, no one has stopped. Supposedly, isn't the UN about the human rights movement?
No, not in the way that I'm talking about. Because see,
you're talking about the spiritual evolution of all of us.
Yes. See, when you talk, the problem with isms are adverse beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors toward people who are different. For example, you have experienced isms, and you and your brothers and sisters based upon IQism. Do you see where people call many people in our family nerds? And that crosses, that's intersectorial. People who have, there's so many, there's lookism, which crosses across all of the racial ethnic categories. There's ageism.
What do you mean lookism? You mean beauty based on people being biased on others based upon their perceptions of beauty?
Yes, people who have perceptions, and it doesn't matter, people who are perceived as being attractive earn more than people who are not perceived. They have quote, what the world calls privilege.
Yeah.
And so, but see, the thing is, when you began to focus upon, this is the problem with isms, is that they create incivilities of people toward each other.
Mm-hmm.
If you raise your voice at a clerk in a store, that's an incivility. And normally it's going to be based upon the ism called class, because you have the power to do so and you can get away with doing it. When an officer of the law misuses power directed toward a person of a different race, ethnicity, or a different ideology, such as the senior citizen my age who was pushed down, okay, it's because of the person perceiving themselves as having power.
Yes.
So what is it that prevents us as humans from abusing, and I see it, you walk down from abusing that power, it's getting rid of all of those isms, looking at them as a collective and looking at oneself and saying, honestly, what are the isms that I embrace? Mm-hmm. How do I act in uncivil ways toward others simply because I think I have the power to do so? Mm-hmm. And even the research shows that when people have a certain level of power, whether it's power within their own racial ethnic group, there's a tendency, it's a natural thing, but people have to be trained not to do it. They have to be aware of it.
Yeah, and
because they began to see others as being not humans, but lesser humans, in the same way any other ism does, to serve them.
And sorry to interject, but I just wrote a paper that used critical theory as a framework, and critical theory is all about looking at power across the various groups and how we either have access or how we don't have access, and what limits us from maximizing who we are.
Yeah, but see, the point is, we all have power, even if it's a parent having power over a child. If a parent spanks a child, that parent is using ageism toward that child and abusing that child, and created something that we call adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. Mm-hmm. So unless we can't see this, as long as we limit it to the ism called race, the ism called sex. And we're looking at these not as a collective problem of humans with some power based upon whatever, not knowing how to manage that. We can't begin to end these incivilities. These incivilities then, if when we end those, imagine how humans have a much greater chance of survival. COVID would be if all of the scientists across the different things we call nationalisms, if you didn't have that ism based upon nation, and all of these wonderful minds that come together immediately, by now COVID would be halted
Yeah.
or gone.
Yeah. So we're at 20 minutes, and so I want,
Okay.
but I would say if anyone has been listening and you got to this far in the conversation and you want to hear more, let us know. I feel like personally, Mommy, it's great for us to archive our, your wisdom, and so I think maybe we should continue to have these discussions as well. So we thank you all, and again, this is my mother, Dr. Betty Burston, and also keep an eye out for the new book. What's the new book, Mommy?
It's called Isms, and it focuses upon healthcare institutions, but the theory is much greater than just in healthcare workplaces, because some of the things that we have talked about today, we talked about in the Isms book. And then there's also the one that's already out, and also everyone is, there are a group of 4 of us. We are different. We are common energies that are clothed in different flesh clothing, because Triya, who's the daughter, is an author on these. Darren Liu, whose flesh clothing is Asian. Heidi Mulligan, who wears the flesh clothing of a person of European descent, is also a part of this collective. And the people, though, who are interested in seeing the elimination of incivilities is growing. And I think it's so critical now that we're beginning to get a group of international people who are saying we are against isms, for us to broaden these isms so that we can be against incivilities.
Okay. All right. Thank you all so much, and we will talk to you soon.